Ready, I cancelled her card. Now she'll have to call me and beg, said my son to his wife. My name is Eleanor, and I am 67 years old. For my whole life, I believed that a mother's love was unconditional, unbreakable, eternal. I believed that children always valued their parents' sacrifices, that family was the most sacred thing that existed. I was wrong, and that mistake almost destroyed me. It all began 2 years ago, when my son, Robert, my only child, the boy I raised alone after being widowed, decided to marry Helen. I was happy for him. Truly, I was. After years of watching him in failed relationships, he finally seemed to have found someone who made him smile. Helen was a sweet, shy girl who worked as an elementary school teacher and always treated me with respect. I thought she would be the perfect daughter-in-law, that I would finally have the unified family I had always dreamed of. When I became a widow 7 years ago, after my husband Richard died suddenly of a heart attack, I learned to be strong. I had to be. I worked as an accountant for 40 years, saved every cent I could, and managed to build something solid. My own house, where Richard and I lived our best years, and 2 small apartments I bought as an investment that I rented out to have a stable monthly income. I wasn't a millionaire. I didn't live in luxury, but I was independent. I had my dignity, my stability, my peace. Or at least, that's what I thought. Robert was always a spoiled child, I admit it. Maybe it was my fault. Maybe after losing Richard, I wanted to compensate for that absence by giving him everything he asked for. I paid for his full college education, bought him his first car when he graduated, and helped him with the down payment for his consulting business. I always thought I was investing in his future, that one day he would do the same for his children, that this was how families worked. When he announced his engagement to Helen, I didn't hesitate for a second to help him with the wedding expenses. I spent almost $15,000 on the venue, the food, Helen's dress, everything. I wanted them to have the perfect day, to start their marriage without debt, without worries. But that's where I made my first mistake. Because after the wedding, Robert came to visit me with a proposal. "Mum," he said, with that charming smile he always used when he wanted something, "Helen and I are looking for an apartment, but the rents in Boston are crazy expensive. How about we rent your apartment on Morelos Street? I'm keeping Morelos Street as a name, but placing it in the US context of Boston. We'd pay you, of course, but it would be much cheaper than looking elsewhere." I looked at my son, saw the hope in his eyes, and I couldn't refuse. I usually rented that apartment for $800 a month, but I told Robert he would only pay me $300, almost nothing, just to cover the basic expenses of the place. "It's okay, son," I replied, "but with one condition. We'll sign a formal contract, all legal, so there are no problems later." Robert laughed, hugged me, and told me I was the best mother in the world. We signed the papers that same week. Helen was beaming. She thanked me 1,000 times and brought me flowers. Everything seemed perfect. The first 6 months were peaceful. Robert paid me on time, visited every Sunday for dinner. I usually made a big roast beef or a slow-cooked pot roast with mashed potatoes and gravy. And Helen called me to ask for recipes or advice. I felt useful, loved, an important part of their lives. I sat down every afternoon in my green velvet armchair, the same one where Richard used to read the newspaper, drank my tea from the white porcelain cup I had inherited from my mother, and looked out the window, feeling that life, despite the losses, still had meaning. But then the subtle changes began, those small details that a mother notices but tries to ignore because she doesn't want to believe something is wrong. Robert started arriving late for our Sunday lunches. Sometimes he didn't even come, sending a text message apologizing, saying he had too much work. When he did come, he seemed distracted, constantly checking his phone, answering in monosyllables, Helen stopped calling me as much, and when she did, her voice sounded tense, forced. One Sunday, when they finally both came for dinner, I noticed something strange. Robert was wearing a new watch, one of those expensive Swiss brand watches that cost thousands of dollars. Helen had a designer handbag hanging on her chair, one of those that cost more than $2,000. I saw them and felt a pang of uneasiness in my chest. "What a nice watch, son," I commented, trying to sound casual. "Was it a gift?" Robert smiled smugly, lifting his wrist so I could see it better. "I bought it myself, Mum. My business is growing a lot. Things are going really well." I nodded and smiled, but inside, something didn't add up. If his business was doing so well, why was he still living in my apartment, paying only $300? Why wasn't he looking for a better place, one more in line with his supposed success? I kept my doubts to myself. I didn't want to be the intrusive mother, the critical mother-in-law. But the signs kept appearing, one after another, like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't yet see completely. 2 weeks after that lunch, I received a call that chilled me. It was from the bank, an automated message informing me about a rejected charge on my credit card due to insufficient funds. I hung up, confused, checked my banking app on my phone, and what I saw took the air out of my lungs. My checking account, where I always kept at least $5,000 for emergencies, had a balance of barely $200. I reviewed the transactions with trembling hands, and there they were. Transfers I hadn't authorized, payments to electronics stores, expensive restaurants, a luxury clothing store. All made in the last 2 months. All for amounts between $500 and $1,500. I felt the walls closing in on me. I immediately called the bank. "Mrs. Eleanor," the executive explained with a professional voice, "these movements were authorized with your additional debit card, the one registered under Robert Delgado as an authorized user." I was speechless. Yes, I remembered adding Robert as an authorized user years ago when he was in college, and I wanted him to have access to money in case of emergencies. But that was more than 15 years ago. I never thought he still had that card. I never imagined he would use it like this. "Can I cancel that authorization?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "Of course, Ma'am, but we need you to come in person with an official ID." I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, staring at the wall, feeling the betrayal settle in my chest like a heavy stone. My own son was stealing from me. There was no other word for it. He was stealing from me, and didn't even have the decency to ask for permission. I took a deep breath, poured myself a glass of water, and decided that before confronting him, I needed to be sure. I needed to understand what was really going on. I didn't want to be the paranoid mother who accuses without proof. So, that same afternoon, I went to the bank, cancelled Robert's authorization, changed all my passwords, and requested a complete report of all transactions for the last 6 months. What I discovered was worse than I imagined. Robert had spent almost $8,000 from my account in total. $8,000 that were mine, that I had earned with my work, with my sacrifices. I felt nauseous, seeing the endless list of purchases, dinners at luxury restaurants, expensive clothes, electronic devices. He had even paid for a vacation to Miami for himself and Helen. All with my money, all behind my back. I put the papers in an envelope, left them in my desk drawer, and waited because I still had a small hope that there was an explanation, that my son would come to me, confess he had financial problems, and ask me for help like a responsible adult. But that hope died 3 days later. It was a Thursday afternoon, around the 4 o'clock hour. I had gone to Robert's apartment because Helen had called me that morning, asking me to bring her some containers of food saying she had been sick to her stomach and didn't feel like cooking. I knocked on the door. No one answered, but I heard voices inside. I used the copy of the key I had as the apartment owner and entered, calling out, "Helen? It's me, Eleanor. I brought the food." Silence. I walked toward the living room, and then I heard it. Robert's voice was coming from his office, the small room he used for work. He was talking on the phone, and his tone was mocking, arrogant, completely different from the one he used with me. "No, bro, I'm telling you it's all resolved," he said, laughing. "I cancelled the extra card I had for my mom before she realized how much I spent. The old lady doesn't even check her statements often. And you know what the best part is? Now that she cancelled my access to her account, I cancelled her primary credit card. I have copies of her documents. I made the call to the bank, pretending to be her advisor. And that's it. Now, if she wants to get her card back, she'll have to call me. She'll have to beg. She'll have to understand that she can't treat me like a kid anymore. It's time she learns who's in control here." I stood petrified on the other side of the door. I felt the floor disappear beneath my feet, all the air rushing out of my lungs at once. My son, my only son, the child I had dedicated my entire life to, was planning to manipulate me, control me, and humiliate me. And the worst was the tone of his voice, that cruel laugh, that sick satisfaction in talking about making me beg. I backed away silently, left the apartment without a sound, walked down the stairs with my legs trembling, got into my car and sat there, clutching the steering wheel, trying to process what I had just heard. The tears came later, when I got home, when I closed the door behind me, and finally allowed myself to feel all the pain, all the betrayal, all the disappointment. I cried like I hadn't cried since Richard's funeral. I cried for the son I thought I had, who turned out to be a stranger. I cried for all the years of sacrifices he trampled without thinking twice. I cried for my naivety, for blindly trusting him, for not seeing the signs sooner. I sat in my green velvet armchair, the same one where I had so often imagined my future grandchildren playing, and felt that the entire future I had dreamed of was crumbling into ashes. But then, between the tears, something changed. I felt a cold rage settle in my chest, a determination I didn't know I had. I looked at the white porcelain cup still in my hand, the cup my mother had given me before she died, the cup that had survived decades of moves and difficulties, and I understood something fundamental. I too had survived worse things. I had survived the death of my husband, years of hard work, and had built an estate from nothing. And I was not going to let my own son destroy me. If Robert wanted to play the smart one, if he wanted to manipulate and control me, he was about to discover that his mother wasn't the naive old woman he thought she was. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake at my desk, reviewing every document I had, the lease for the apartment where Robert lived, the papers for my properties, my bank accounts, everything. I reviewed every detail with the meticulousness of the accountant I had been for 40 years. And as I reviewed, a plan began to form in my mind. A cold, calculated, perfect plan. Robert wanted to make me beg. Fine. But he was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. Because it turned out that the apartment where he lived so comfortably, paying only $300 a month, was still entirely in my name. And the contract we had signed had a very specific clause that I myself had included. Immediate cancellation of the contract in case of non-compliance or inappropriate conduct by the tenant. I smiled for the first time in days, a small, sad but determined smile. The next morning I would call my lawyer, and then the real game would begin. At 8 o'clock in the morning on Friday, I called Eric Marshall, my trusted lawyer for more than 20 years. Eric was the one who helped me with all the legal paperwork when Richard died, who reviewed the purchase contracts for my apartments, who always advised me with patience and honesty. Eleanor, he answered with his warm, familiar voice. What a surprise to hear from you so early. Is everything okay? I took a deep breath. Eric, I need you to review a lease agreement and tell me exactly what my rights are as the owner to cancel it. There was a pause. Problems with a tenant? His voice became professional, alert. Yes, I replied, feeling the word stick in my throat. With my son, Robert. Eric didn't ask unnecessary questions. He asked me to send him a copy of the contract by email and scheduled a meeting at his office that same afternoon. At 3 o'clock, I was sitting across from his desk, watching him read every line of the document carefully. Finally, he looked up, took off his glasses, and looked at me with a mixture of pity and understanding. Eleanor, I'm so sorry you're going through this, but legally you have every advantage. This contract clearly specifies that it requires 30 days' notice for cancellation by either party, but it also includes this clause for immediate termination for justifiable cause. If you can prove that Robert engaged in fraudulent conduct or misused your confidential information as the owner, you can cancel the contract immediately. I took the envelope from my purse with the bank statements, copies of the unauthorized transactions, everything perfectly organized. Eric reviewed each paper carefully, taking notes in his notebook. This is enough, he finally said. Robert used an old bank authorization to access your money without your current consent. That is a breach of trust. Technically, it could be considered family fraud. You have solid grounds to cancel the contract. He explained the process to me. I needed to send a legal eviction notice with 72 hours' notice. A judicial officer would have to deliver it by hand, and after that period, Robert and Helen would have to vacate the property. Are you sure you want to do this? Eric asked me gently. He's your son, Eleanor. Once you take this step, there's no turning back. I looked out his office window, saw the city stretching out under the grey afternoon sky, and thought of all the times Robert had hugged me as a child, all the nights I spent awake caring for him when he had a fever, all the sacrifices I made believing I was building a future for him. And then I remembered his words. Now she'll have to call me and beg. I remembered the cruel laugh, the contempt, the satisfaction in planning my humiliation. I am absolutely sure, I replied, with a voice I didn't recognize as my own, cold and firm. Proceed with everything, Eric. I want the eviction executed exactly on Monday at 6 o'clock in the evening. Eric nodded and immediately began drafting the documents. While he worked, I took out my phone and checked my bank accounts. Just as Robert had promised on the phone, my primary credit card was blocked. I called the bank, explained the situation, filed a formal complaint for identity theft, and after 2 hours of bureaucratic procedures, I managed to get my card reactivated and block any future access Robert might have. I also changed all my account passwords, updated my security questions, and made sure none of my documents were within my son's reach. On Monday morning, a judicial officer knocked on Robert's apartment door. I watched him from my car parked across the street, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Helen opened the door, received the envelope with the legal notification, and signed the acknowledgement of receipt with trembling hands. I saw her read the document, watched her face turn pale, and her eyes fill with tears. I felt a pang of guilt because Helen really seemed like a good girl, but I reminded myself that this was necessary, that I couldn't allow Robert to keep manipulating me. The officer left. Helen closed the door, and I started the car and drove home, feeling a strange mix of power and sadness. Over the next 3 days, Robert tried to call me 16 times. 16 calls I rejected one after another. He sent me text messages that said things like, "Mum, I urgently need to talk to you. I don't understand what's happening. Please, answer." I deleted every message without responding. He also tried to come to my house, knocking on the door for 20 minutes one Tuesday night, yelling, "Mum, I know you're there. Open the door. We need to talk." I remained seated in my green velvet armchair, drinking my tea from the white porcelain cup, listening to his knocking and his pleas without moving, because now he was the one begging. Now he was the one who needed something from me, and I had decided he wouldn't get anything until it was too late. On Wednesday afternoon, 2 days before the eviction, I received a call from Helen. Her voice sounded broken, desperate. "Eleanor, please. I know Robert did something wrong. He told me everything. I know he used your money without permission, and I didn't know anything, I swear to you. I thought everything he bought was with his work money. Please, give me a chance to explain." My determination wavered for a moment. Helen's voice sounded genuine, scared. But then I remembered that Helen had used that $2,000 handbag bought with my money, that she had gone to Miami with my money, that she had enjoyed all those luxuries while I worked hard to keep my savings. "Helen," I replied calmly, "I understand you're scared, but my decision is made. The lease ends on Friday at 6 o'clock in the evening. You have until that time to vacate the apartment." "But where are we going to go?" Helen sobbed. "We don't have any money saved for a new apartment. Robert says his business is having problems, that he doesn't even have money for a deposit anywhere else." Those words confirmed my suspicions. Robert had not only stolen from me, but he had also lied about the success of his business. He had spent my money trying to maintain a facade of prosperity that didn't exist. "That's not my problem, Helen," I replied, and hung up the phone before she could say anything else. My hands were shaking. I felt like a terrible person, but I reminded myself that I hadn't created this situation. Robert did. He made the decisions that brought us here, and now he would have to face the consequences. I barely slept on Thursday night. I knew that the next day, at 6 o'clock in the evening, Robert and Helen would have to leave the apartment. I knew they would probably come to my house afterward, that there would be an inevitable confrontation. I spent the whole day mentally preparing, reviewing all the documents I had over and over again, the bank statements, the recordings of the calls to the bank reporting the fraud, copies of all the threatening messages Robert had sent me when he finally understood that I was not going to back down. I organized everything in a red folder, left it on my living room table, and waited. Friday dawned cloudy, with that grey sky that seemed to foreshadow a storm. I got up at 6 o'clock in the morning, made my coffee, and sat in the kitchen watching the clock move slowly. Every minute felt like an hour. At 9 o'clock, Eric called me to confirm that everything was in order, that the judicial officer would be present at exactly 6 o'clock to supervise the eviction without incident. "Do you want me to be there with you?" he asked with genuine concern. "No," I replied. "I need to do this alone." But that wasn't entirely the truth. In reality, I needed to see Robert's face when he realized he had completely underestimated his mother. I spent the day in a strange state of tense calm. I cleaned my house from top to bottom, even though it was already spotless. I watered my plants, organized my closet, and prepared food that I didn't have the appetite to eat. Anything to keep my hands busy and my mind distracted. At 5:45, my phone started ringing non-stop. It was Robert. I rejected the call. He called again immediately. I rejected it again. Then a text message arrived. "Mum, please, just give me 10 minutes to explain everything. I made a mistake, I admit it. But you can't do this. We are family." I read the message and felt a bitter laugh rising in my throat. Now he wanted 10 minutes to explain. Now we were family. But when he was planning to make me beg, when he was laughing about me with his friends, when he was stealing my money to maintain his fake lifestyle, then he didn't care that we were family. I didn't answer. I silenced my phone and put it in my purse. At exactly 6 o'clock, I received a message from Eric with a photo. It was Robert's apartment. I could see mountains of boxes stacked in the living room, suitcases piled by the door, and furniture heaped in disorder. The judicial officer was standing in the center, supervising. Helen was sitting on the sofa, crying with her face in her hands. And Robert wasn't there. As Eric explained to me via message, Robert had run out of the apartment 30 minutes earlier, shouting that he was going to fix all this, that his mother couldn't do this to him. I smiled. I knew exactly where he had gone. 20 minutes later, I heard a car brake sharply in front of my house. Hurried footsteps, desperate pounding on my door. "Mom, open the door. We need to talk now." Robert's voice sounded agitated, furious, and desperate. I got up from my armchair, smoothed my pants, took a deep breath, and walked toward the door with slow, measured steps. Every step was a conscious decision. Every step was a reaffirmation of my dignity. I opened the door and there was my son. His hair was messy, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes injected with fury and panic. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted without even greeting me. "How can you kick us out onto the street like this? I'm your son." I looked at him in silence for long seconds. I observed every detail of his face, looking for any trace of genuine remorse, of shame, of acknowledgement of what he had done. I found nothing. There was only indignation, as if he were the victim, as if I were doing something unfair to him. "Come in," I finally said, stepping aside. Robert entered like a storm, walked straight into my living room, and turned to face me with clenched fists. "Explain what's happening. Why did you cancel the contract without telling me? Why aren't you answering my calls? Helen is destroyed. She's crying non-stop, and I don't know what to tell her." I sat in my green velvet armchair, crossed my hands over my lap, and looked at him with a calm I didn't know I possessed. "Sit down, Robert." My voice sounded soft but firm, the voice of someone who has complete control of the situation. He hesitated, clearly expecting a fight, yelling and drama, but I wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. I said, "Sit down." This time, my tone was sharper. Robert slumped onto the couch across from me, his leg bouncing nervously, his hands rubbing against each other. "Tell me what you want," he spat the words out. "If it's money, if you want me to pay you something, we can arrange a payment plan, but you can't leave us homeless from one day to the next." I took the red folder I had left on the table and placed it on my lap, still unopened. "Robert, let me ask you a question. Do you remember when you were 10 years old and were accused of stealing money from the school's cash box?" He blinked, confused by the change of subject. "What does that have to do with—" "Answer the question," I interrupted him. Robert clenched his jaw. "Yes, I remember. And you defended me because you knew I hadn't." "Exactly," I nodded. "I defended you because I trusted you, because I believed your word. Because that's what mothers do. We trust our children even when everyone else points fingers." I got up, walked to the window, and watched the street darkened by the sunset. "For years, Robert, I defended you to everyone. When your father said I was spoiling you, I defended you. When your teachers said you were irresponsible, I defended you. When your own friends warned me that you were changing, I ignored them, because I thought I knew my son better than anyone else." I turned to look at him. But it turns out everyone was right, and I was blind. Blinded by love. Blinded by the hope that my son would be an honest and grateful man. Robert stood up abruptly. "What are you talking about?" Why are you talking like I'm some kind of criminal? I just needed a little borrowed money. I was going to pay you back. His voice rose in volume. His cheeks flushed. Borrowed? I repeated the word slowly. Borrowed money is taken without permission? Borrowed money is spent on luxury watches and vacations, while your mother is still working to make ends meet. I opened the red folder and took out the bank statements. $8,200, Robert. That's what you took from my account using an authorization I gave you 15 years ago for college emergencies. I placed the papers on the coffee table, one by one, like cards in a poker game. Robert looked at them, and his face went from red to white in seconds. I thought that you have money, Mum. You have your apartments, your savings. His voice became small, childish. And that gives you the right to steal from me? I asked, and the word steal dropped between us like a bomb. I didn't steal from you, he shouted. I just borrowed it. Stealing is taking what does not belong to you without the owner's permission. I recited the definition with an icy voice. And that is exactly what you did. Robert began pacing back and forth across my living room, running his hands through his hair. Fine. Fine. I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Is that what you want to hear? I'm sorry. Well, I'm sorry, Mum. Now please, let us stay in the apartment. I promise I'll pay you back every cent. I watched him fall apart, saw the arrogance turn into desperation, and I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected to feel. I only felt a deep emptiness, an immense sadness for everything we had lost. Do you know what the saddest thing about all this is, Robert? I asked in a measured voice, feeling every word weigh tons. It's not the money. I can get the money back by working, saving, being careful. The saddest thing is that you destroyed something that can never be recovered. My trust. And without trust, there is no family. Robert stopped pacing and looked at me with pleading eyes. Those same eyes he used as a child when he wanted to convince me to buy him a toy or let him stay up late. But he wasn't a child anymore. He was a 35-year-old man who had made conscious, calculated, cruel decisions. Mom, please, his voice broke. I know I messed up. I know it. But give me a chance to fix it. Helen has nothing to do with this. She's innocent. You can't leave her on the street for my mistakes. I raised an eyebrow. So now you're worried about Helen? How interesting. Because when you spent $2,000 on that designer handbag for her, when you paid for that vacation to Miami, when you showered her with gifts with money that wasn't yours, you didn't think about the consequences she would face when all this came to light. Robert opened his mouth to reply, but I raised my hand to stop him. I'm not finished. I took another document from the red folder. It was a printed transcript of the phone call I had secretly listened to, the one Robert had with his friend. I had asked a technician to help me properly document it from my phone, where I had recorded parts of the audio. I want you to read this out loud, I said, handing him the paper. Robert took it with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the lines, and I saw the color completely abandon his face. Mum, Read it, I ordered, with a voice of steel. He swallowed. His hands were shaking so much that the paper crinkled. I already cancelled her card, he began to read in a barely audible voice. Now she'll have to call me and beg if she wants anything. It's time she learns who's in control here. Every word came out of his mouth like poison. The old lady doesn't even check her statements often. She's perfect for manipulating. I saw tears begin to accumulate in his eyes, but I felt no compassion. I had spent all my tears during these days. I had processed all my pain in solitude. Now, only the cold, hard truth remained. Keep going, I instructed when he paused. My mum has always been weak. She always gives in to everything I ask for. I thought it was time to take charge of her finances before she spends everything on nonsense. Robert dropped the paper as if it burned his hands. I didn't mean that. I was angry. I was just talking. Angry about what? I interrupted him. Angry because your mother gave you everything for 35 years and finally wanted to set a limit? Angry because a 67-year-old woman still has control over the money she earned herself with her work? I stood up and walked toward him, looking him directly in the eyes. Let me explain something that you seem to have never understood, son. I am not weak. I survived the death of the love of my life. I worked 40 years in a job I didn't always like to build an estate. I raised a child alone who constantly challenged me and demanded more. None of that is weakness. What you confused with weakness was unconditional love. But it turns out that even unconditional love has limits. Robert dropped to his knees in front of me, literally on his knees, his hands clasped in a pathetic plea. Mum, I beg you, forgive me. I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. I'll seek help. I'll change completely, but please don't leave us homeless. Helen is pregnant. Those last words fell like a bomb in the middle of the room. I froze, feeling my carefully constructed plan threaten to crumble. What did you say? My voice sounded distant. Strange. Helen is pregnant, Robert repeated with renewed desperation. 2 months along. We hadn't told you yet because we wanted to wait until the 3rd month. But now I need you to know. You're going to be a grandmother. Mum, you can't do this. You can't leave your grandchild homeless. I backed away as if I had been physically struck. A grandchild. I was going to be a grandmother. For years I had dreamed of that moment. I had imagined what it would be like to hold a baby again, to watch him grow, spoil him and love him. And now Robert was using that information as a weapon, as a desperate last card to manipulate me. I saw in his eyes that he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he had found my weak point. And in that moment, I understood that if I gave in now, if I allowed this news to change my decision, I would be establishing a pattern that would repeat for the rest of my life. Robert would learn that he could do whatever he wanted, hurt me however he wanted, and there would always be something to use to manipulate me. First the grandchild, then the child's well-being, then his education, always something. Get up, I told him with a trembling but firm voice. Mom, please. I said, get up. My tone allowed no discussion. Robert slowly stood up, wiping his tears with the back of his hand. I looked at him and tried to find the child he once was, the little boy who hugged me and told me I was the best mum in the world. But that child no longer existed, if he ever truly existed at all. Congratulations on the baby, I finally said. I hope you are a better father than you have been a son, and I hope that child never, ever has to go through what I am going through now. Robert opened his mouth to speak, but I continued. The eviction stands. You have until 11 o'clock tonight to get all your things out of the apartment. After that time, the judicial officer will change the locks, and any belongings left inside will be considered abandoned. I saw the last bit of hope die in his eyes, replaced by something darker, resentment, even hatred. You know what? He said with a voice full of venom. You're right. I'm not the son you expected. But you're not the mother I thought you were either. A real mother would never leave her son out on the street with his pregnant wife, no matter what he had done. You're a bitter, lonely old woman, and you're going to die bitter and lonely. His words were designed to hurt me, to make me feel guilty, to destroy my determination. And they hurt, I won't lie. They hurt like 1,000 knives stabbing my heart. But I had already cried all my tears. I had already processed all my pain. His words no longer had the power he thought they had. Maybe, I replied with chilling calm. Maybe you're right, and I will end my days alone. But I'd rather be alone with my dignity intact than accompanied by someone who sees me as an ATM. Now please, get out of my house. Robert looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and fury. This isn't over, he threatened. I'm going to get a lawyer. I'm going to sue you for wrongful eviction, for family abandonment, for whatever it takes. I nodded calmly. You're free to try. Eric Marshall, my lawyer, will be happy to present all the evidence of financial fraud, misuse of confidential information, and breach of trust that we have compiled. We can also include this conversation where you try to emotionally manipulate me using your unborn child as a hostage. You decide which path you prefer to take. Robert clenched his fists. His whole body trembled with contained rage. For a moment, I thought he might become violent, but then something in him broke. His shoulders dropped, his jaw loosened, and all the rage turned into absolute defeat. You're going to regret this, he said quietly, but it no longer sounded like a threat, but like a last desperate attempt to have the last word. He walked toward the door, opened it abruptly, and before leaving, he turned one last time. When that child is born, don't expect to meet him. Don't expect to be part of his life. You chose your money over your family. Now live with that decision. The door slammed shut with a bang that echoed throughout the house. I stood in the middle of my living room, surrounded by silence, holding the red folder against my chest like a shield. My legs began to shake, my whole body began to tremble, and I finally collapsed into my green velvet armchair. The tears I had contained throughout the confrontation finally flowed, silent and bitter. I cried for the grandchild I might never know, for the family that had just been completely destroyed, for the lost innocence I would never regain. I spent that entire night awake, sitting in my armchair, watching the shadows the street projected on the walls of my living room. Every noise startled me. Every car that passed in front of my house made me think Robert had returned. But he didn't return. At 11:30 in the evening, Eric sent me a message confirming that the apartment had been completely vacated, that Robert and Helen had taken all their belongings in a moving truck, and that the locks had been changed. "Are you okay?" he asked at the end of the message. I didn't answer because I didn't know the answer. I wasn't okay, but I wasn't sorry either. I was in an intermediate place, an emotional limbo, where relief and pain coexisted in equal proportions. The following days were the hardest of my life, even worse than the days after Richard's death. Because when Richard died, I at least had the consolation of knowing that our love had been real, that we had built something beautiful together. But with Robert, everything felt contaminated. Every happy memory of his childhood now came with the question, when did he start seeing me as a means to get what he wanted instead of as his mother? Did he ever genuinely love me, or was I always just a resource for him? Those questions tormented me during the day and kept me awake at night. A week after the eviction, I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, but something in me needed to know who it was. "Eleanor." It was Helen's voice, small and fragile. "It's me, Helen. Please don't hang up." I remained silent, waiting. "I just want you to know that I didn't know anything," she continued, her voice breaking. "I didn't know Robert was using your money. He told me his business was doing great, that we could afford those luxuries. When I saw the gifts, the expensive dinners, the vacations, I thought we were finally progressing. I never imagined it was all with stolen money." Her voice broke on the last word, and I heard her sobbing on the other end of the line. "Why are you calling me, Helen?" I asked with exhaustion, without the energy for more drama. "Because I need you to know the truth," she replied between sobs. Robert is not the man I thought he was. Since you kicked us out of the apartment, he has shown his true colors. He's furious all the time. He blames me for not being more useful in convincing you. He says that if I had insisted more, you would have given in. We're living at his friend Adrian's house, sleeping on a sofa bed, and Robert spends all day looking for ways to get revenge on you instead of looking for a job or a new apartment. A chill ran down my spine. Get revenge how? Helen took a deep breath. He's been calling your neighbors, telling them you're a cruel old woman who abandoned her pregnant son on the street. He's posted horrible things about you on social media, saying you're an unnatural mother. He even talked about going to your job, about making a public scene to humiliate you. My heart started beating faster. Helen, if you're calling me to scare me— No, she interrupted urgently. I'm calling to warn you, and to ask you something. I'm leaving. Eleanor, I'm going back to my parents' house in San Diego. I can't stay with a man who is capable of hating his own mother so much. If he's capable of doing this, what will he do to me when the baby is born and things get tough? I felt a mixture of relief and sadness for Helen. I think that's a wise decision, I told her sincerely. But before I go, Helen continued, I need to give you something back. 2 days later, Helen came to my house. She arrived in a taxi with a small suitcase and a paper bag in her hands. She looked haggard, with deep circles under her eyes, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. I invited her in, but she shook her head. I can't stay long. Robert thinks I'm at the doctor. I just came to give you this. She handed me the paper bag. Inside were several items. The designer handbag Robert had bought her, a pair of expensive earrings, and a silk scarf. I don't want them, Helen said firmly. They were bought with your money. They don't belong to me. I took the bag, touched by the gesture. Helen, this isn't your fault. I know, she interrupted me, but I still can't keep them. Every time I see them, they remind me of this whole mess. We were silent for a moment. Is the baby okay? I finally asked, unable to contain the question that had been gnawing at me inside. Helen nodded, placing her hand on her still flat belly. Yes, he's fine. I just had my first ultrasound. She hesitated a moment, then took a photo from her pocket and handed it to me. I thought maybe you'd want to see it. I took the photo with trembling hands. It was a blurry, black and white image, where I could barely make out a small shape that would be my grandchild. I felt something break inside me. All the defenses I had built crumbled in an instant. He's beautiful, I whispered, tracing the outline of the image with my finger. Eleanor, Helen said softly, I know Robert did terrible things to you. I know he has to face the consequences of his actions. But this baby is innocent. And even though you and Robert can't fix your relationship, I hope that someday you can meet your grandchild. Because all children deserve to have a grandmother, especially one like you. Her words pierced me like arrows. One like me, I repeated bitterly. Robert called me a cruel, bitter old woman. Helen shook her head. Robert is hurt and resentful, but I saw how you were with him when he came to visit you. I saw how you prepared his favorite meal every Sunday, how you kept his childhood photos in your living room, how your face lit up every time you talked about him. That's not a cruel woman. That is a woman who loved her son unconditionally, until he broke that trust in the worst possible way. Tears began to roll down my cheeks, and I couldn't stop them. Thank you, was all I could say. Helen hugged me, a brief but sincere embrace, and then walked away toward the taxi waiting for her. When the baby is born, I'll send you photos, she said before getting in. And when he's ready, if you're ready, you can meet him, but far from Robert. at least until he decides to grow up and be a real man. I watched the taxi drive away down the street and stood in my driveway, holding the ultrasound against my chest, feeling a mixture of hope and pain that I didn't know how to process. That night, I put the ultrasound in a small frame I had saved and placed it on my nightstand, where I could see it before I went to sleep. I also saved the items Helen had returned to me. The next day, I took them to a consignment store and sold them. The money, about $3,000, I deposited into a new account I opened specifically for my future grandchild. If Helen kept her word and allowed me to be part of the baby's life, that money would be there for his education, for his future, for the things that really mattered. Days passed and turned into weeks. Robert never contacted me again, never threatened me again, and never showed up at my work as Helen had warned he would. It was as if he had disappeared from my life completely, leaving only a huge void where my son had once been. Some days, that void hurt so much I could barely breathe. Other days, I felt relieved, free from the toxicity our relationship had become. I learned to live with that duality, with the fact that both feelings could be true at the same time. A month after the eviction, I was at the supermarket doing my weekly shopping when I heard a familiar voice calling my name. Eleanor? Eleanor Delgado. I turned around and saw Mary Beth Stevens, a former colleague from my years as an accountant. We hadn't seen each other in at least 5 years. Mary Beth, what a surprise. I greeted her with a genuine smile. Mary Beth approached, pushing her cart, her face showing concern. Eleanor, I heard some rumors, and I need to know if you're okay. Someone told me your son was saying horrible things about you on social media, that he accused you of abandoning him. I sighed, feeling the weight of the situation again. It's a long story, Mary Beth. She took my hand in hers. I have time. Do you want to grab a coffee after shopping? I accepted her offer. I needed to talk to someone who wasn't involved in the drama, someone who could give me an outside perspective. An hour later, we were sitting in a small coffee shop, and for the first time since it all began, I told my complete story to another person. I showed her the documents, told her about the stolen money, Robert's cruel words, Helen's pregnancy, everything. Mary Beth listened to my whole story in silence, without interrupting, only nodding occasionally or squeezing my hand when the most painful parts came out of my mouth. When I finished, I felt exhausted, but also strangely relieved, as if sharing the weight of everything that had happened had made it a little lighter. Mary Beth took a long sip of her coffee, looked me directly in the eyes, and said something I will never forget. Eleanor, you did exactly what you had to do, and anyone who judges you for it doesn't understand what it means to set healthy boundaries, even with your children. Her words surprised me because I had been expecting her to tell me I had been too harsh, that mothers should always forgive, all those cliches that society teaches us to repeat without question. Do you really think that? I asked with an insecure voice. Mary Beth nodded firmly. Of course. Look, I have kids too, 3 to be exact. I love them with all my soul. I would give my life for them without hesitation. But if one of them stole from me, lied to me, and then planned to manipulate and humiliate me, I would do exactly the same thing you did. Because loving your children doesn't mean allowing them to destroy you. Loving your children also means teaching them that actions have consequences. I felt tears of relief rolling down my cheeks. For weeks I had tortured myself thinking I was a bad mother, that I had failed in some fundamental way. Hearing another mother, another woman who understood the complexity of these relationships, validate my decision was like a balm for my wounded soul. But the baby, I whispered. I'm going to lose the chance to know my grandchild. Mary Beth shook her head. Helen told you she would send you photos, that eventually you could meet him. That door is not closed, Eleanor. And honestly, if Robert continues down the path he's on, eventually that child is going to grow up and ask his own questions. He's going to want to meet his grandmother. The truth always comes out. I left that coffee shop feeling stronger than I had felt in weeks. Mary Beth was right. I had done the right thing. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been painless, but it had been necessary. That night, for the first time since the eviction, I was able to sleep through the night without waking up with nightmares. I dreamed of Richard, of the happy days we had shared, of his laughter and his way of always finding the positive side of things. In the dream, he took my hand and said, "I'm proud of you. You were braver than I would have been." The weeks turned into months. I rented the apartment where Robert had lived to a young newlywed couple who paid on time and treated me with respect. I went back to my usual routine. I worked from home doing accounting consulting for small businesses, tended my garden, and visited Mary Beth for coffee on Thursdays. Life continued, quieter than before, lonelier too, but with a peace I hadn't felt in years. I no longer had to worry about calls asking for money, visits where Robert only wanted something from me, or that constant feeling of being used. One day in October, 3 months after the eviction, I received a package in the mail. It had no return address, just my address written in a feminine handwriting that I recognized as Helen's. I opened the package with trembling hands, and inside I found a letter and several photographs. The letter read, "Dear Eleanor, I want you to know that I returned to San Diego with my parents. I officially separated from Robert 2 weeks ago. He is not seeking help. He is not changing. He is just sinking further into his bitterness and resentment. My parents are supporting me with the pregnancy. I am now 5 months along, and it's a boy. I decided to name him Richard, in honor of your husband, because when you told me stories about him, you always talked about what a good and honest man he was. I hope my son grows up to be like his grandfather, not like his father." I continued reading with tears falling onto the paper. The photos I included are from my latest ultrasounds. The baby is healthy and growing well. When he is born, I would love for you to meet him, if you want to. I know I can't replace the relationship you lost with Robert, but maybe we can build something new, something healthy, for Richard Jr. You don't have to answer now. Take your time. I just wanted you to know that I haven't forgotten you, and that I don't blame you for anything. With love, Helen. The photographs showed a perfectly formed baby, with tiny hands, feet, and profile. My grandson, Richard. I felt a wave of love so strong it took my breath away. That same afternoon, I responded to Helen using the return address she had included in the package. I thanked her for keeping me informed, told her I would love to meet Richard when she was ready, and included a check for $2,000 to help her with the baby's expenses. I also sent her the framed ultrasound she had given me months ago, thinking she might like to have it. In my letter, I wrote, "Helen, I admire your strength and courage in making the difficult decisions that will protect your son. I am here when you need me, not as an intrusive mother-in-law, but as someone who genuinely cares about you and Richard." 2 weeks passed before I received a reply. Helen called me crying, thanking me for the check, telling me her parents also wanted to meet me, that her whole family was grateful that the baby would at least have a grandmother who cared about him. We talked for almost an hour, catching up on our lives, sharing hopes for the future. For the first time in months, I felt that maybe, just maybe, something good could come out of all this pain. In November, I received another call, this time from a number I didn't recognize, but which had the same area code as Robert. I answered cautiously. Eleanor Delgado. It was a professional male voice. Yes, this is me. My name is George Harrison. I am calling on behalf of your son, Robert Delgado. He wishes to initiate legal proceedings against you for wrongful eviction and emotional distress. I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my voice calm. I understand. I recommend you contact my lawyer, Eric Marshall. I gave him Eric's number and hung up. I immediately called Eric and told him about the call. He sighed deeply. Eleanor, this was expected. Robert is desperate, and that lawyer probably promised him he could win some money with a lawsuit. But don't worry. We have all the necessary documentation to defend your case. The eviction was completely legal and justified. They don't have any solid basis. How long will this take? I asked, feeling tired. Probably several months. But trust me, we are going to win. Eric was right. The following months were exhausting, filled with court summons, depositions, and meetings with lawyers. But every time I had to testify or present evidence, I reminded myself why I was doing this. The trial took place in February, a cold, grey day that seemed to perfectly reflect the state of my heart. I arrived at the courthouse accompanied by Eric, dressed in my best beige pantsuit, my hair pulled back with dignity, and my mother's same white porcelain cup stored in my purse like a talisman of strength. Robert was already there when we entered, sitting next to his lawyer, George Harrison, a man in his 40s with a grey suit and an expression of professional boredom. Our eyes met for a second, and what I saw in my son's eyes chilled my blood. There was no remorse, no sadness, only a cold, hard resentment, like steel. The judge, an older man named Judge Thompson, called the court to order and began the hearing. Robert's lawyer spoke first, painting a picture of a cruel mother who had kicked her pregnant son and his wife onto the street without warning, without compassion, and without real justification. Your Honor, George said with a dramatic voice, my client and his wife were literally left homeless from one day to the next. Mrs. Delgado acted with calculated coldness, without caring that her daughter-in-law was pregnant, without considering the consequences of her actions. This was not only an unjustified eviction, it was an act of family cruelty that deserves compensation. I listened to every word, feeling the rage bubble up in my chest, but I kept my face serene, my posture dignified. Eric had prepared me for this. He had told me Robert's lawyer would try to make me look like the villain of the story. When it was Eric's turn, he stood up calmly and began to present our evidence. The bank statements, showing the $8,200 Robert had taken without authorization. The copies of the conversations where Robert planned to manipulate and control me. The lease agreement that clearly stipulated the causes for immediate termination. Every document was meticulously presented, every piece of evidence building an unbreakable case. Your Honor, Eric said with a clear and firm voice, what we have here is not a cruel mother abandoning her son. What we have is a 67-year-old woman defending her estate and her dignity from an adult son who was financially exploiting her. Robert Delgado is not an innocent victim. He is a 35-year-old man who stole from his own mother, who planned to continue manipulating her, and who now seeks to victimize himself when he finally faced consequences for his actions. I looked at Robert and saw his jaw tighten, saw his hands clench into fists on the table. The judge then asked me to take the stand to give my testimony. I walked forward, my legs trembling, but keeping myself upright. Robert's lawyer questioned me first, asking questions designed to make me look like a heartless mother. Mrs. Delgado, is it true that you executed the eviction knowing your daughter-in-law was pregnant? Yes, I replied with a clear voice. You didn't care about leaving your future grandchild homeless. Let me correct something, I said, looking him directly in the eyes. I didn't leave anyone homeless. Robert is an adult man with a college education that I paid for, with work experience, perfectly capable of finding another place to live. What I did was stop allowing him to live on my property, paying minimal rent, while he stole thousands of dollars from me. George tried to interrupt me, but the judge stopped him. Let her finish. I continued, feeling years of pain turn into words. For 35 years, I gave my son everything I had. I worked double shifts to pay for his studies. I spent my savings on his wedding. I offered him my apartment for a fraction of its real value. And he took all that and used it against me. He not only stole money from me, he planned to control me financially, humiliate me, and make me beg. All this while I still believed I was helping my son build his future. Tears began to roll down my cheeks, but I didn't wipe them away. I wanted everyone in that room to see my pain, to see the betrayal I had suffered. "And the baby?" George insisted. "You don't care about your grandson." "I care deeply," I replied with a broken voice. "That's why I opened a savings account with the money from the things Robert bought with my money. That's why I maintained contact with Helen, even after Robert threatened me. That's why I'm going to be part of my grandson's life if Helen allows me to. But I'm not going to allow Robert to use that baby as a tool of manipulation, as he tried to do when I told him the eviction would stand." I saw Robert suddenly stand up from his chair. "That's a lie," he shouted. "You never cared about us. You only care about your money." The judge struck his gavel. "Order. Mr. Delgado, sit down immediately or I will have you removed from the courtroom." Robert slowly sat down, but his gaze toward me was pure venom. The rest of the trial was a parade of evidence and counter-evidence. Eric presented written testimonials from my neighbors attesting to my character, from former colleagues confirming my professional integrity. He even presented a sworn statement from Helen, who from San Diego confirmed that Robert had hidden the origin of the money he spent from her, and that she fully supported my decision to set boundaries. Robert's lawyer tried to discredit every piece of evidence, but it was evident against that he didn't have much to work with. The truth was on my side, cold and documented. After 3 hours of hearing, the judge retired to deliberate. Eric and I waited in the hallway, sitting on an uncomfortable wooden bench, without talking much. Robert and his lawyer were at the other end of the hallway, Robert pacing back and forth like a caged animal. 40 minutes later, we were called back into the courtroom. Judge Thompson had a serious expression as he read his verdict. After reviewing all the evidence presented, he began with a solemn voice. "This court determines that the eviction executed by Mrs. Eleanor Delgado was completely justified and legal." I felt my whole body relax with relief. The judge continued. "The evidence clearly demonstrates that Mr. Robert Delgado engaged in fraudulent conduct by improperly using his mother's financial resources. The lease agreement included specific clauses regarding termination for justifiable cause, clauses that Mr. Delgado violated. Furthermore, the recordings and transcripts presented show intent to manipulate and emotional abuse." The judge looked directly at Robert. "Mr. Delgado, the law does not protect adult children who exploit their elderly parents. Your mother had every right to protect her estate and her well-being. The lawsuit is dismissed in its entirety." But the judge was not finished. "In addition, this court orders Mr. Robert Delgado to reimburse his mother the amount of $8,200 that he took without authorization from her bank accounts, plus interest and legal costs. Mr. Delgado has 6 months to comply with this payment. Otherwise, further legal action will be taken." I saw Robert turn completely pale, saw his lawyer whisper something in his ear, probably explaining that he had just lost not only the trial, but now also had to repay the stolen money, plus his own lawyer's fees. The judge retired, and the room began to empty. Eric hugged me, congratulating me on the victory. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt exhausted, empty, as if I had run a marathon only to reach a finish line that no longer meant anything. While Eric collected the documents, Robert approached me. His lawyer tried to stop him, but he abruptly pulled away. We stood face to face, mother and son, separated by an abyss that no court judgment could close. "I hope you're happy," he said with a voice full of bitterness. "You won your money. I hope it's worth losing your son." I looked into his eyes, that son who had once been my whole world, and I felt a sadness so profound I could barely breathe. "Robert," I said softly, "I didn't lose my son. You lost your mother the day you decided that my value was in my bank account and not in the love I gave you for 35 years. He opened his mouth to reply, but no sound came out. We stood there in silence until he finally turned around and left the room without looking back. 3 months after the trial, on a warm day in May, I received a call from Helen. Her voice sounded different, tired but happy. "Eleanor, he's born. Richard is here." I felt my heart expand in my chest, as if every cell in my body was waking up with a joy I hadn't felt in years. "Are you both okay? Are you okay?" I asked with a trembling voice. "We're perfect. It was a long labor, but without complications. He weighs 7.5 pounds, has the most beautiful eyes I've ever seen, and I think he has your nose." She laughed softly. "Eleanor, I know you just won the trial and things have been difficult, but I would love for you to come and meet him. My parents want to meet you too." 2 days later, I was on a bus heading to San Diego, my heart pounding so loudly I thought everyone on the bus could hear it. I carried a bag full of gifts for the baby, clothes I had knitted myself during sleepless nights, a soft ivory blanket, a small teddy bear, and a letter I had written for Richard Jr., explaining who his grandfather had been, the man in whose honor he was named. I also carried my mother's white porcelain cup, carefully wrapped in silk paper. Someday I would give it to Richard, so he would know that some things survive the storms. Helen's parents' house was small but cozy, painted light yellow with a garden full of flowers. Helen opened the door and we hugged, 2 women united by tragedy, but also by the hope of something new. Come in," she said, guiding me inside. "Mom, Dad, this is Eleanor." An older couple approached, smiling. Audrey, Helen's mother, was a plump woman with rosy cheeks and kind eyes. Frank, her father, was a tall, thin man with working hands and a shy smile. "Welcome to our home," Audrey said, hugging me as if she had known me all my life. "Helen told us everything. You're a very brave woman." And then I saw him. In a small wooden crib next to the sofa, wrapped in a light blue blanket, slept Richard. I approached with slow steps, almost afraid, as if it were a dream that could break if I moved too fast. He was perfect, small, fragile, with black fuzz on his head, his fists clenched next to his little face, his cheeks round and pink. "May I?" I asked Helen in a barely audible voice. "Of course," she replied. "He's your grandson." I extended my arms, and Helen carefully placed Richard in them. The weight of that baby, that new and innocent life, took my breath away. All the tears I had held back for months finally flowed freely. "Hello, Richard," I whispered, as he opened his tiny eyes and looked at me without really focusing. "I'm your grandma Eleanor. I'm so sorry I wasn't here from the beginning, but I promised to be here now. I'm going to tell you stories about your grandpa Richard, the kindest man I ever knew. You're going to grow up knowing that you come from a line of strong, honest people who don't give up even when everything seems lost." The baby yawned, moved his little hands, and one of his fingers curled around mine. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope that the mistakes of one generation didn't have to be repeated in the next, that this child could grow up and be different. I spent 3 days in San Diego, getting to know Helen's family, helping with Richard, sharing meals and conversations. Audrey and Frank treated me with a warmth I hadn't expected, as if I were part of their family. One night, while Helen slept and I held Richard, who didn't want to sleep, Frank sat down next to me. "Eleanor," he said with his gentle voice, "Helen told us everything that happened with Robert. I want you to know that we don't judge you. You did what you had to do. And this child will have the privilege of knowing a grandmother who had the courage to set boundaries even when it hurt." His words comforted me in a way I didn't know I needed. When I returned home, everything looked different. The walls that had felt so empty now seemed full of possibilities. I placed a photo of Richard in my living room, next to the photos of Richard Sr. I started making plans to visit them once a month, to maintain that connection, to be the grandmother that child deserved. Robert never contacted Helen asking about his son. According to her, he had completely disappeared after the trial. He wasn't paying the child support the judge had ordered. He wasn't calling or writing. It was as if he had decided that if he couldn't have control, then he didn't want anything. 6 months after Richard's birth, in November, I received a legal notification. Robert had filed for bankruptcy, and the money he owed me would probably never be seen. Eric called me, apologizing, explaining the legal options we had. But I stopped him. "Let it go," I told him. "I don't want to chase that money anymore. I don't want to have any connection with him." It was true. The money no longer mattered. I had won something much more valuable. My dignity, my peace, and a relationship with my grandson that grew stronger every day. A year after the eviction, I was sitting in my green velvet armchair, drinking tea from my mother's white porcelain cup, looking out the window at the garden that Richard and I had planted together so many years ago. In my lap, I had a photo album of Richard Jr., already 1 year old, taking his first steps, smiling with 2 tiny teeth. Helen sent me photos every week, called me to tell me about his progress, and included me in every important moment. The child called me Gamma, his version of Grandma, and every time I heard it, my heart melted. Mary Beth came to visit me that day, as she did every Thursday. I showed her the most recent photos, told her about Helen's plans to move closer to my city so Richard could see me more often. "Look how far you've come," Mary Beth said, squeezing my hand. "A year ago you were heartbroken, and now look at you. You rebuilt your life, you set healthy boundaries, and you gained a beautiful relationship with your grandson." She was right. The pain had been immense, the loss and devastating, but I had survived. And I had not only survived, I had flourished in ways I never imagined possible. Some nights, I still thought about Robert. I wondered where he was, if he ever reflected on what he had lost, if he would ever come seeking reconciliation. I had decided that if that day came, I would listen to him. But reconciliation would require more than empty apologies. It would require real responsibility, genuine change, and time. A lot of time. For now, I focused on what I had. My house, my peace, my dignity intact, and a beautiful grandson who filled my heart with joy every time I saw him. I took my white porcelain cup, the same one I had held in the worst days of my life, the same one my mother had given me, telling me that some things are too valuable to break, and took a long sip of tea. I looked at the photo of Richard Sr. on the wall and spoke to him silently as I often did. I did it, love. It was horrible. It was heartbreaking. But I did it. I set boundaries. I defended my dignity. And our grandson is going to grow up knowing he came from strong people, people who don't let themselves be trampled, even by those they love. The sun began to set, filling my living room with a warm, golden light. I stood up, watered my plants, prepared some dinner, and sat down to eat in peace. My house was my fortress, my refuge, my kingdom. And I had learned, in the most painful way possible, that sometimes loving someone means letting them go. It means closing doors you never thought you would have to close. But I had also learned that on the other side of those closed doors, new windows sometimes open, opportunities for different but equally valid love. That night, before going to sleep, I wrote in my journal, something I had started doing as therapy during the difficult months. Today marks exactly 1 year since I made the hardest decision of my life. A year since I chose my dignity over the comfort of remaining a victim. I don't regret it. It hurts. It probably always will hurt a little, but I don't regret it. Because I learned that true love, the love that is worthwhile, does not require you to destroy yourself to prove it. I learned that setting boundaries is not cruelty, it is survival. And I learned that even at 67 years old, I can still be brave. I closed the journal, turned off the light, and fell asleep hugging the photo of Richard Jr., dreaming of all the Sunday afternoons we would spend together, all the stories I would tell him, and all the love I still had to give. My house is my fortress, and now I know exactly who deserves to be inside.